Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. And unfortunately, I can't burn the sweetgrass, but I can explain it a little bit. And usually I use woman's sage, because that's the one we can use at any time. Even on our moon time, we can use sage. But elders use different medicines. But I always like using woman's sage because I've always kind of worked with women's organizations all my life, so I get along real good with this medicine. Okay? So, however, when we first, I'm just going to explain a little bit about this, and I want to thank the organizers for presenting the tobacco, which is the protocol that you do, So thank you for the tobacco, So because tobacco is, we don't use it personally, we use it, it's medicine, and we use it in all kinds of ceremonies, and give blessing and to say our prayers, to give an offering to that. Even when we pick berries, sweetgrass, we give tobacco, so it's used in many different ways, but it's not for personal use, So I want to thank you for that. And so normally what we do before I say the prayers, I'd be burning this east from the easterly direction first to all the sacred directions. That's what I was told by my elder, to honor these 4 directions because they're very important for us in life, And then he said, if it's flaming, don't blow it out because the Creator has already blown its breath to give it life, let it burn itself out. Usually it's pretty good at this. And so we cleanse our mind, body, and spirit before we converse with the Creator or any kind of ceremony. We cleanse ourselves, and usually we remove all the jewelry and the glasses, because we came into this world with nothing, and we're only going to leave with our spirit, We're not going to be wearing glasses to heaven. So therefore, he had said we remove everything. So it's kind of hard to try and show you what we do with this when I have to hold this mic on one side,
Would you like to?
So yeah, and so therefore, when we the smoke is, it carries our prayers to the Creator. When the smoke is, going up like this, we cleanse ourselves all over. We cleanse our eyes, so we're going to see the good in people. We're not going to focus on the negative. We also cleanse our ears, so we're going to listen to the good things in life. We're not going to bother listening to the negative things. We also cleanse our mouth, so we cleanse that, so we're not going to spend our time cursing and gossiping and stuff like that, We cleanse our hearts, so we bless, we have blessings and love for, whoso will be blessed with that. So that's what we do, we cleanse ourselves with that. So that's what, and we use the eagle feather also, for fanning the tobacco or the medicines, whatever you're using. And of course, I'd be here for quite a while explaining the symbolic meaning of the eagle feather. It takes a while, big teachings in that, okay? So I won't go into that, but I'll just say the prayer. And so I'll just say my prayer. Thank you, Creator, for being here with us. Givers of life, Creator. That is such a beautiful role that you've given us as mothers and grandmothers and as women, Creator. We just thank you for that. I love gatherings like this where women get together because they are leaders and givers of life, Creator. So we just thank you for that. And be with us today. Help us to supersize all those blessings you've given us, like the physical ability, the mental and the emotional and the spiritual ability that you've given us, Creator. We just thank you for everything that thou hast given us, Creator. You blessed us so greatly. So be with each and every woman that are here. And if there's any gentlemen in the crowd, Creator, we thank you for them too, because men are equally as special for us. They just have different roles. So bless each and everybody here, Creator, and I just thank you for everything. Hi, hi. Hi, hi means thank you in our language, okay? That's it, I guess, okay?
Thank you so much.
And if I was burning sweetgrass, I would have worn my skirt in respect to the culture, but since I'm not, you know, so, but I brought it along anyway. So, thank you.
So thank you very much to the organizers for organizing this. My name is Janice Williamson, and this is Sheena Wilson. I'm going to speak first for about 10 minutes, and then Sheena is going to speak. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for that very informative and beautiful blessing. Thank you. My interest in intersectionality really is on the ways in which the structuring series of power relations that shape our lives. And we all experience these. We've all experienced them, and we all will start to recognize, if we're not familiar with the term intersectionality, what these structuring power relations are. As Equity Chair of the Association of Academic Staff at the ASUA at the University of Alberta, I am conscious of the gap between those with continuous and precarious employment. So those are structuring relations of power. The way institutions and corporations increasingly rely on precarious, underpaid labor to do the work. And we know that women and visible minorities tend to be overrepresented in precarious work. And there are multiple forms of discrimination, including issues of disability, that are relevant here. Last week, I organized a panel on Islamophobia and its intersections. And it was really inspired by a question I had about how women's issues circulate in our discussions of Islamophobia when wars and conversations can begin with these stereotypic structures of power relations where white people are very keen to go and protect Muslim women, helpless Muslim women, from those terrible barbaric Muslim men. That's a kind of discourse or narrative, a master narrative that circulates that shows us some of the power relations that are at work in our society. And of course, that story completely discounts how many women, Muslim women, identify themselves. And while there are critiques of patriarchy in Islam, of course, there is also room to acknowledge the many liberated Muslim women among the more than 1 billion Muslims who define themselves in terms of their own agency and their own ability to act. The panel I organized a few days ago was organized on the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And that day was determined by the United Nations to commemorate a particular historical moment. In 1960, on March the 21st, police opened fire in South Africa and killed 69 people in a peaceful demonstration in Sharpeville. And the demonstration was against the apartheid pass laws. So 6 years later, when the UN established that day, they intended us to think through the structuring power relations that organize racial discrimination in our own lives around the world. Our solidarity with Indigenous peoples in Canada is rooted in our understanding of settlements, of settler culture, and the nearest successful genocide, what has been called the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and the enduring legacy of colonization and settlement that haunts us to this day. And we remember that Canada's system of reservations was used by South Africa to model their apartheid system organization of Banistans, where they banished Africans. The African American activist and theorist Angela Davis reminds us that it is not enough today to be against racism, but nowadays we must engage as anti-racists and allies. I live in a transracial family, but my experience of Islamophobia emerged when I edited an anthology about the Canadian child soldier who was in Guantanamo for more than a decade. When I edited that book, I was reminded in my conversations with Muslims across the country that I had a real privilege as a non-Muslim to speak out about terrorism. And in fact, a number of them told me that they were too concerned about being defined as terrorists if they spoke out in defense of Omar Khadr. So that's a space where allyship and a recognition of my own privilege as a non-Muslim allowed me to speak in a way to support Muslims in a moment of terrible Islamophobia, which really is what has defined a lot of our years here in Canada post 9/11. So at this point, I'm working with a group of women on a Crossing Bridges project, which is intended to gather digital stories about racism and anti-racism, and that will be announced in a few weeks. But I'm working with women, an African-American woman, an Arab-Canadian woman, and other women in a collaboration to develop a space for all of us to tell our stories in order to see the shape of racism and anti-racism today. When I think about intersectional analysis, I think about how intersectionality is not a personal identity. It's not something that's fixed. It's not just me as a white woman here in this particular moment in time. Intersectionality refers to those overarching social forces that shape us. So patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, the tyranny of ability that discounts the value of those with disabilities. And intersectionality is about power, it's about privilege, it's about discrimination, and it's also about abjection, that is the suffering that comes when people are discriminated against, marginalized, and excluded. And one of the things that I think about to enliven our understanding of intersectionality is gender identity. How, over the course of my life, the notion of gender identity has shifted. It used to be that you were male or female, you were one of these binaries, or you could be a kind of butch, or you could be a kind of femme, but there wasn't that discourse of gender that allowed for a critical understanding of the they, she, him, her, the blurring of these pronouns, and the ways in which we can take up multiple positions. And I think there is a recent study that suggested that 25 years ago, about 7% of millennials identified as having non-binary gender identity, and now millennials, up to 20% of millennials identify this way. So you can see the intersectional social forces change over time. Even in 25 years, it's almost tripled. So it's a very lively and vital and dynamic concept. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who is a critical race theorist, an African-American woman, was working on issues around discrimination in the workplace. And in 1989, she coined the term intersectionality. And she did that in order to make sure that we understand how it is that in gender systems, race can be buried, and in race systems, gender can be buried. So she tried to work on thinking about how do you talk about the experience of Black women in the workplace. And when she was doing this work, she was criticized because the courts were concerned that two different arguments were being made about Black women, a gender argument and a race argument. And she said, well, we have to use those two different arguments because that's what intersectionality is. These are dynamic social forces that work to inhabit people's lives in all kinds of ways that we have to take into account. So when I think about my own life, I think about the ways in which I came to understand intersectionality. I took my first women's studies class in 1973, where I learned to think about my own experience in terms of the social history of women. Then I was a bit of a bohemian, and I took off on my own and traveled across Europe and West Africa. And there I became really conscious of myself as a racial minority in the context of West Africa. And I also came to see the ways in which culture defined race and gender so differently in different places. It was a very eye-opening experience. And I could see how intersectional blindnesses could interrupt my own experience. So my own sexuality over the course of my life has been quite slippery. And I was always glad when Adrienne Rich developed this notion of the lesbian continuum, that to find her kind of rule that refused those binary oppositions and said, you know, you can take up these positions along the lesbian continuum, and it can inform your life differently over time. So I've always defined myself as bisexual, even though I think the definitions now are much richer and more open. But that's sort of what I'm used to, so I'll just stick with it. At that time, and when I was coming out as bisexual and writing about it, it was a kind of, on the one hand, it was outlandish and forbidden, and on the other hand, it was cool and sexy, depending on where I was hanging my hat. But I ended up working with a group of women in Toronto. It was called the International Women's Day Committee, and I see it really as an intersection with this group now, this Women's March group, and we would meet every year in a large space where there were women's groups, and we could share knowledge and information. It was a very important moment of connection. And we were a small group of women, but we organized with 60 women's groups the International Women's Day March, where about, 5,000 or 6,000 women would come out in March every year. And at that time, it was full of these discussions about the march and what our themes were filled with difficult conversations every year, because we had many interests, many diverse experiences and histories, and we had to puzzle through and work those things out. So we would develop an anti-racist theme, we would develop a women and work and union theme, we would develop an immigrant women theme, we developed a theme of women's choice. These iterations of what it meant to be a woman activist changed every year. But the intersections of our histories and of the social forces that shaped us really was what generated the themes and the conditions of our actions. And I think that the issues at that time, I'm in literary studies, so I used this late French theorist Roland Barthes. He had a notion of network of connections that he used in his literary theory, and that's how I defined what I saw as intersectionality until Kimberly Crenshaw came along and developed intersectionality, which is a much more dynamic notion. But when I think about intersectionality today, and I think about the kinds of intersectional connections that we could make right now, I think as someone who is 65, that one of the things I really want to see is the connection between older women and younger women. And one where older women, with humility and with understanding and openness, come together with young women to share our experience and our expertise, not necessarily as leaders, but as collaborators and as allies. Because I think that there are so many of us who are at points in our lives when our children have grown and left, we may be leaving the workforce, we may have more time on our hands, and it's a great opportunity, I think, for us all to get together and to do important work together. Okay. I think I better stop. I've got other things to say, but I do think that the other two things I want to talk about, maybe some other time individually with you, is just thinking about family forms and how intersectionality can shape how we think about the family. How do we think about the family beyond blood relations? I'm an adoptive mother of a racialized child, and how is it that we can think through our relations differently in the family? And the other thing is, but what about violence against women? How do we think about the different ways in which we experience violence against women? Indigenous women are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than non-Indigenous women. And those kinds of facts really should generate our actions around intersexuality in important ways.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm really happy to see so many people here. Maybe I'll give you a bit of background about what we were asked to do and why we're talking about intersectionality. Allison asked Janice and I to talk a little bit about intersectionality because, as I understand it, some of you were asking about intersectionality. And we were given 10 minutes, so for such a rich topic that has a long history, it's difficult to squeeze everything into 10 minutes. But I decided that I would provide you with a brief definition and talk about a couple of quick historical examples that I can draw on that many of you may know about and put them in context, and then talk about my own research on women's lives, climate change and energy transition, and why that might be relevant here, and then think about what it means to be doing this kind of work, working together collaboratively in Edmonton, in Alberta, on Treaty 6 land. So, as Janice mentioned, intersectionality is a theory that comes out of critical race studies. Intersectionality can be a theory, it can be a methodology, it can be a lens, it can be a paradigm, it can be a framework, so it can be many things, right? And I like to think of intersectionality as a matrix, right? So there are many, we're not one subject on one place in the matrix, right? These things move based on power relations around us, right? So at some moments we can be oppressed, and at other moments we can be oppressors, and we have to think about how that functions. So in short, intersectionality refers to overlapping systems of oppression and privilege that shape our lives depending where we each are individually located in the matrix of social, economic, and power relations, right? And those ongoing histories of colonialism, racism, heteronormativity, ableism, neoliberal capitalism, just to name a few, how those are swirling around us, right? So thinking about us here in this room, as women marching forward, we must consider our complex subjectivities that impact each of us differently, in different contexts, based on where we're positioned in the matrix and also within the movement. So what are our relationships to one another? And once we've considered that, then we need to think about what kinds of actions we take to make sure that all of us are moving forward together and that some of us aren't benefiting more than others from the actions that we take. So I was thinking about women's history, right? The history of the women's movement, as you know, is filled with examples of collective action that did not always produce equal outcomes for all women. So the right to vote is an easy example. Last year in Alberta and this year and next year, there will be these moments of celebrating, 100 years, a centennial of women voting. But in reality, that's 100 years of white women in Canada voting. And we can think about why the reasons for that are historically, but Japanese Canadians, Indo-Canadians, Chinese Canadians, the Doukhobors, the Inuit, Aboriginals, they all got the right to vote sometime between 1947 and 1960. And when white women got the right to vote in the early 20th century, from like 1916 to 1918 approximately, what that meant was that reinforced a certain notion of white Canada. So, we celebrate this as a moment for women, but we also have to think about what other power dynamics and systems of oppression it's reinforcing. And then I think about another moment, in the 1970s, and 80s, more women enter the workforce than ever before, and we celebrate this as a moment, of women's liberation. But what that also did was it provided a cheap labor force. We were a cheap labor force that entered the market. It gave a boost to an economy that had flatlined. And 30 years later, we think about how we now need two incomes to basically support a household. The middle class is dwindling, and that we've really reinforced and deepened neoliberal capitalism. So there are these inadvertent impacts of our actions, and we want to think about how they function within other systems, because what's really complicated about the world that we live in is that if we don't resist the systems in which we live, we perpetuate them. And I think of Hannah Arendt, whom many of you know, of course, right? And when she, listens to the trials after the Second World War and determines really that evil is quite banal, and it's many of us just not questioning the systems that we live within, just being good, you know, bureaucrats and citizens or whatever the case may be, and that we have to think seriously about how we have to stand up and ask questions so that they aren't just questions about, you know, us or women. We have to think about how they function in a much larger matrix of power dynamics so that we're actually disrupting those power structures. So that brings me to a little bit about my own work. I run a project called Toward Feminist Energy Futures. I'll go back to my notes here. Who knows where I am? It's called Toward Feminist Energy Futures, in which I research what kinds of opportunities might be created by the fact that we will have to move in order to respond to climate change to less carbon-intensive ways of living. And as we do that, we will be forced to reorganize our societies and our communities. So as we reorganize our communities, we can think about things like what Janice mentioned, the way we shape family life, right? How we live together in community, and that maybe we could create more socially just communities for everybody, right? Communities that don't rely on a whole lot of unpaid or underpaid domestic, women's labor, for example. And that would just be one example. So I argue that to first imagine and then mobilize towards feminist futures that are less carbon intensive, we must recover feminist and pre-colonial knowledge that has been scrubbed from our ways of thinking and doing and from our worldviews. So through an intersectional lens, I examine why and how the logics of Western Enlightenment that separated the body from the mind and us from nature, and clearly women were not us, right? Women were much closer to nature, people of color were much closer to nature, right? So the modernity that we live now recognizes hierarchies of knowing that are authenticated by objectivity. And objectivity is defined as having distance from nature, which is inherently masculine. We can see this loop, how it functions, right? It works really well to make sure that women and people of color are not, their knowledges are not recognized. So by rejecting subjective relationships to knowledge, whole bodies of knowledge and bodies with knowledge of land and environmental relationships have been overwritten. So currently our logics, we have to recognize this, have been sanitized of non-patriarchal modes of thinking and being, namely feminist and indigenous ones. So for me, intersectionality means also decolonizing our thinking, and that means both a letting go of existing hierarchies of knowledge that privilege Western reason and science above all other ways of knowing, and a welcoming in of other knowledge systems, including but not restricted to feminist and indigenous knowledge. So it is possible and necessary as we gather here in Edmonton at this moment of truth and reconciliation to consider from an intersectional feminist perspective our relationships to Treaty 6 territory where we live and work and study. Whether we are Indigenous women or settlers several generations back or have newly arrived, we have the opportunity to ally and act collectively for the advancement of many equally important causes. There are many ways to think intersectionally, but I would suggest that energy transition provides one focus around which we can organize feminist work to achieve greater social justice at this historical moment. So I would be very happy to talk about that.